in the oppressive summer of 1856. Hidden deep within the Texas countryside, an event took place that those who owned slaves simply referred to as the race. This was no mere contest. It was a pre-planned slaughter, a form of entertainment bathed in blood for affluent men whose lives of luxury, constructed on the anguish of others, had left them jaded. Each year, during the 3 nights when the moon was absent, planters journeyed from all over the South to Blackwater Plantation. They arrived with their gold, and with spirits utterly devoid of humanity. The rules were brutally straightforward. At 9 o'clock at night, 10 enslaved men were turned loose into the swamp. A quarter of an hour later, the hunters would go after them. These were white men on horseback, carrying rifles and accompanied by packs of canines, specifically trained to rip apart human flesh. Wagering would commence weeks prior. Questions were posed. What would be the survival time of the swiftest? How many bodies would be retrieved by daybreak? Which owner possessed the slave with the greatest endurance? In the history of the Blackwater race, not a single person had ever made it out alive. Across a span of 7 years, 70 black men had been cast into that hellish marsh. 70 men had met their end, whether by bullet drowning, being torn to pieces by dogs, or simply being consumed by the mud and the darkness. Their corpses became food for the alligators. Their identities were erased before the sun could rise. And come morning, as house servants cleaned the blood from their master's footwear, existence on the plantations resumed its normal course, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Yet, during the 8th year, a shift occurred. Among the 10 individuals chained in the yard of Blackwater Plantation, that June evening was one the other slaves referred to simply as Abel. His back bore the marks of 200 lashes. His eyes had seen his wife and children sold away to other plantations. His hands knew only toil and suffering. Yet his mind had been actively working for months, devising something unimaginable to any slaveholder. As the white men indulged in imported whiskey and tallied piles of gold coins under lantern light, as they readied their firearms and fed their dogs uncooked meat to whet their bloodlust, Abel looked at the 9 men beside him. And each one returned his gaze, for they were all aware that this evening would be different. This night, those who hunted would themselves become the hunted. Before we proceed with this startling narrative, let me know which city you're watching from, and be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any future stories. Let's get back to it. The Blackwater Plantation extended over 3,000 acres of the East Texas wilderness. It was a place where pine forests transitioned into cypress swamps, and the very land seemed to harbor mysteries within its murky waters. Colonel James Whitmore had received the estate from his father, together with 147 human beings he regarded as mere cattle. But the colonel had become wary of cotton and tobacco. He desired something more thrilling than profit margins and agricultural summaries. That was when he devised the race. The initial year, 1849, had been nearly spontaneous, arising from a drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters about whose enslaved men could navigate the swamp most quickly. By the 2nd year, news had disseminated across the South. Affluent individuals journeyed from as distant as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their best horses, their most lethal weapons, and their most expendable human property. The occurrence became legendary within the obscure circles of the plantation elite. It was spoken of in hushed tones, at gentlemen's clubs, debated over cigars and brandy, yet never referenced in refined company, or when northern abolitionists might overhear. The swamp itself was ideally suited for the objective. Extending 2 miles in depth and 3 miles across, it was a maze of dark water, cypress roots, patches of quicksand and predators, both reptile and insect. A person could vanish there permanently, many had, but while Colonel Whitmore believed he governed every facet of his twisted contest, he had committed one essential error in judgment. He assumed the men he sent into that morass were shattered, defeated, too terrified and exhausted to contemplate anything beyond their immediate survival. It never occurred to him they might formulate a plan. He never considered they could exchange information. He never imagined they could coordinate, and he certainly never suspected that his own domestic servants, the ones he relied upon to serve his meals and polish his boots, were involved in a plot. 3 months prior to the 8th annual race, Abel had been acquired by Blackwater Plantation for $800. He had arrived in restraints, his body wasted from weeks on the auction circuit, his spirit assumedly crushed by the separation from his family. Connell Whitmore considered it a good deal. A prime field hand for almost half the usual price of Vodal's $500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Abel's standing as a source of trouble had significantly decreased his market value. At his former plantation in Louisiana, he had made 2 prior attempts to escape. On both occasions he was apprehended and disciplined with 100 lashes each time, the resulting scars forming a brutal pattern across his back, a testament to resistance. What the colonel remained ignorant of was that Abel had acquired knowledge during those unsuccessful escape efforts. He had learned the value of patience. He had learned to observe, to listen, to collect information while presenting a facade of being defeated and broken. Most significantly, he had realized that freedom attained in isolation was not true freedom at all. Not when it meant abandoning brothers and sisters to captivity. Not when one's own liberation depended on the continued misery of others who had provided aid, shelter, and kept one's secrets. On his 3rd day at Blackwater, while laboring in the cotton fields beneath the brutal June sun that made the air feel as thick as honey, Abel overheard 2 overseers talking about the race. They spoke casually, finding amusement in recounting the previous year's event, mentioning how the total bets had reached $20,000 in gold coins and paper currency. They described how one man had covered nearly a mile before the dogs caught him and savaged his legs. They laughed about another who had attempted to conceal himself underwater, inside a hollow cypress tree, and drowned by remaining submerged too long. The overseers found all of this immensely funny, slapping their thighs and wiping laughter from their eyes. They noted that Colonel Whitmore himself had netted 4,000 from a wager that no slave would survive past midnight, confirming once more that the colonel understood his property better than anyone. Abel remained silent. He kept his gaze downward, his hands moving steadily through the cotton plants, adding to his sack the white fiber that created southern fortunes. But internally, his thoughts were active, calculating, retaining every detail. That evening in the slave quarters, a collection of crude wooden huts behind the main residence, where the enslaved population existed in conditions scarcely adequate for livestock. Abel sat quietly as the other men and women consumed their sparse portions of cornmeal and salted pork. These portions were precisely calculated to supply just enough nourishment to maintain their ability to work, yet never sufficient to quiet the constant pangs of hunger. He paid attention to their discussions, learning identities, connections, social standings, the invisible structure that operated beneath the surface of plantation existence. There was Samuel, a powerfully built man who served as the plantation's blacksmith, valued at a minimum of $2,000 because of his specialized abilities in metalwork and repairs. There was Moses, quick and intelligent, who cared for the colonel's horses, including a thoroughbred stallion worth $3,000 that had been transported from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, who had been at Blackwater longer than anyone else. 15 years of continuous servitude that had left him thin but watchful, his worth potentially reduced to around $500 because of his age and visible weariness. There was Caleb, young and robust at 22, bought just months earlier from an Alabama plantation for $200. His youth and vigor made him valuable for the most demanding fieldwork. There was Ruth, one of the household servants, who cleaned the colonel's study and overheard discussions the white men assumed were private. Her value was set at $1,000, even though she could read and write, abilities she kept carefully concealed, as literacy in an enslaved person was viewed as hazardous. Abel observed all of them closely. During those initial weeks, he spoke little, establishing himself as quiet and obedient, never drawing focus to himself. He labored diligently, never voiced complaints, never directly met the gaze of white men, carried out every task with mechanical precision. The overseers started to become less vigilant around him, persuaded that the punishments at his previous plantation had finally extinguished whatever rebellious nature he once possessed. They ceased monitoring him as closely, stopped checking on him as often. And that was precisely what Abel intended. Invisibility offered a type of freedom. The freedom to watch without being watched, to strategize without raising suspicion. It was Ruth who made the first move. She came to his cabin on a night without moon, 2 weeks following his arrival, drifting silently through the darkness like an apparition. Abel had been resting on his coarse straw bedding, looking at the ceiling through openings in the wooden planks, when her form appeared in his doorway. The cabin measured barely 10 feet square, with walls that didn't fully reach the roof and a dirt floor that became mud when it rained. 6 men slept there, crowded together. However, that night, Abel was by himself because the others were on night duty at the sugar house. "You're thinking about something, aren't you?" she whispered. It was phrased not as a query, but as an assertion of fact. Abel stayed motionless, uncertain whether this might be a trap. Sometimes, house slaves would report to the master in return for minor privileges. An extra portion of meat, a warmer blanket, a day exempt from labor. Those in power called them good slaves and compensated their disloyalty, while the other enslaved individuals called them something far worse. Ruth seemed to perceive his uncertainty. "I'm not an informant. I've been here for 6 years. I've witnessed 3 races. I've seen 30 men enter that swamp, 30 men who never returned. One of them was my brother. His name was Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs caught him within the first hour. I could hear his screams from the main house, where I was serving brandy to the men who were betting on how long he would survive." Abel sat up slowly, in the dim starlight filtering through the gaps in the cabin walls. He could now see her face distinctly, the intense hatred burning in her eyes like embers, the same hatred he carried within his own chest as a constant burden. "I overheard the overseers talking about you," Ruth went on, her voice scarcely audible even in the quiet. "They mentioned you tried to flee twice before, at that Louisiana plantation. Said you endured 100 lashes each time and didn't cry out, didn't plead, didn't give in. Said you're either the bravest fool they've ever encountered or the most perilous. I believe you're perilous, and I believe you're planning something for the race." Abel examined her for a considerable time, weighing the potential consequences. Then he gave a single slow nod, committing himself to trust, because without trust, there could be no strategy, no opposition, no possibility. "The colonel keeps his firearms in a cabinet in his study," Ruth said rapidly, as if she had been waiting months to disclose this information. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all loaded and prepared. The key is on a hook behind his desk, next to his father's portrait. Every evening following dinner, he consumes a bottle of bourbon, occasionally 2 if his day went well. By 10 o'clock, he can barely walk straight. The overseers play cards in the barn until midnight, drinking corn whiskey and betting small change. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but just one handler sleeps nearby in a small room attached to it, and he's deaf in his left ear from a hunting accident 5 years ago. Abel experienced something stir in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous, deceptive hope that could lead to your demise if you placed too much faith in it, yet also the only thing that rendered survival worthwhile. "How many others are aware?" he asked softly. "Samuel is aware. Moses is aware. Isaiah has been discussing it for years. But he never had anyone prepared to take the lead. No one crazy enough to attempt it. There are others too. People who work in the house, people who move around the grounds. Possibly 10 or 12 people in total who would assist if they believed there was a genuine opportunity. We've been waiting for someone like you." During the subsequent weeks, Abel navigated cautiously through the plantation, establishing contact with each individual Ruth had identified. They gathered in small clusters, never exceeding 3 at a time, always in different spots, to prevent creating a recognizable pattern. In the blacksmith's workshop, where the sound of hammer on metal concealed their murmured conversations. In the tobacco curing barn, where the thick foliage absorbed sound and created areas of shadow. By the cistern behind the kitchen, where the noise of drawn water masked their voices. Each meeting was brief, purposeful, dedicated to collecting information and establishing trust. Samuel, the blacksmith, became vital to their strategy. Despite his physical size, he was a contemplative man, someone who had spent years working with metal and fire, comprehending how materials could be formed and altered. He began putting aside pieces of scrap iron, secretly shaping them into simple yet effective implements, a blade fixed to a wooden handle capable of penetrating flesh, a spike that could be driven through bone, lengths of chain that could strangle or be used for restraint. He worked gradually, cautiously, never taking sufficient material to be noticed, never working on the weapons when anyone was observing. Over 8 weeks, he accumulated enough weapons for 10 men, concealing them in 3 different locations around the property. Buried in oiled cloth to prevent rust, positioned where they could be retrieved swiftly when needed. Moses studied the horses and the layout of the property with a trained eye. He had worked with animals since childhood and understood their behavior, their fears, their instincts. He reported that the colonel owned 8 horses, all kept in the main stable near the house. The thoroughbred stallion was worth more than any 3 slaves combined, and the colonel guarded it zealously, checking on it personally every evening. However, the other horses were often left unsupervised after dark, their stable doors closed but not secured. The assumption was that no slave would dare attempt to steal a horse, because the penalty was death by hanging. Moses also charted the swamp entrances, identifying which paths led to quicksand and which were comparatively safe. This was information accumulated over years of retrieving game birds, shot by the white men during hunting expeditions. He knew where the water was shallow enough to wade through, and where it abruptly dropped to depths of 8 or 10 feet. He knew which cypress trees had roots you could stand on, and which concealed sinkholes that would swallow a person entirely. Isaiah, despite his age and fatigue, despite the way his hands shook from years of harsh labor, proved to have the sharpest memory of anyone Abel had ever encountered. He recalled every detail of the previous 7 races, describing the precise timing, the positioning of the hunters, the routes taken by those who fled. He remembered that the hunters always divided into 3 groups, one circling left around the swamp's perimeter, one circling right, one driving straight through the center in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side of the swamp, where the ground was most solid and allowed them to gain speed. He remembered that the colonel himself never entered the swamp, instead observing from a raised platform near the starting point, a wooden structure about 8 feet high that provided him a clear view of the initial pursuit. From that platform, he collected bets from latecomers and distributed winnings to those who had accurately predicted survival times and methods of death. Last year's race had drawn 17 plantation owners with a betting pool of 23,000 in gold and paper currency, the largest sum yet accumulated for the event. Ruth continued her service in the main house, listening to every conversation, reading every letter left carelessly on the colonel's desk, observing the patterns and routines of the White family and their visitors. She learned that this year's race was scheduled for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon, when darkness would be absolute and the hunting most difficult. She learned that invitations had been dispatched to planters across 5 states, each one delivered personally by trusted servants. She learned that the colonel had boasted to his peers about acquiring fresh inventory, including a troublemaker from Louisiana, who was certain to provide exciting entertainment, a clear reference to Abel himself. She learned that the participation fee for hunters had been increased to $500 per night, with all proceeds going into the prize pool, making this year's event potentially the most profitable yet. The colonel anticipated this year's race would be the largest ever, perhaps attracting 30 participants and a betting pool exceeding 40,000. But most importantly, Ruth learned something the colonel had mentioned casually over dinner one evening, something he regarded as unimportant, but which fundamentally altered Abel's planning. This year, for the first time, the colonel planned to allow the selected slaves to spend the afternoon before the race unchained, to let them build up hope before crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological torment would make the event more engaging, that men who spent hours contemplating possible escape routes would run harder, fight more desperately, provide better sport for the paying audience. The concept had originated from one of his guests the previous year, a Mississippi plantation owner who claimed extensive experience in managing slave psychology for peak performance. When Ruth communicated this to Abel, he smiled for the first time since arriving at Blackwater. It was not a pleasant smile, not the expression of happiness or joy, but the smile of a man who had just been presented with the means to destroy his enemy. "That's when we make our move," he said quietly. The strategy developed gradually over the following weeks, improved through dozens of whispered conversations, evaluated against every potential obstacle they could envision. They would not attempt to flee during the race itself, which is what everyone anticipated, what every slave before them had attempted. They would not run blindly into the swamp, where the landscape and experienced hunters gave all advantage to the white men. Instead, they would reverse the entire event, converting the hunters into the hunted, using the confusion and darkness to their benefit, and striking back with a violence that would resonate across the South for generations. But they required more than weapons and timing. They needed individuals willing to die if necessary, willing to fight against overwhelming odds, willing to sacrifice personal survival for collective vengeance. They needed men who had reached the point where death held no fear, because life had become indistinguishable from death, where the only remaining choice was between dying like livestock or dying like warriors. Abel approached each candidate personally, usually late at night, always in private. Caleb was first. The young man from Alabama had been chosen for the race, selected because of his youth and vigor, qualities the colonel believed would provide exciting sport. A man who would run fast and far before being brought down. When Abel explained the plan in complete detail, withholding nothing, Caleb's eyes widened with a combination of fear and something else, something that appeared almost like hunger. "You're talking about killing white men," Caleb whispered, the words barely forming on his lips. "They'll pursue us forever. They'll kill everyone on this plantation. They'll create an example that will be remembered for 100 years. They're going to kill us anyway." Abel responded calmly, stating it as simple reality. "You've been selected for the race. You understand what that means. You have maybe one chance in 100 of seeing sunrise, and that's if you're fortunate. Most men don't last 2 hours. The record is 3 hours and 40 minutes, set 3 years ago by a man named Joshua, who made it almost to the western edge, before the dogs trapped him against a ravine. They say he fought the dogs with his bare hands for 15 minutes before a hunter shot him in the head. That's the best anyone has ever done. 3 hours and 40 minutes of terror before dying. Is that the death you want?" Caleb remained silent for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. Then he nodded slowly. "I would rather die fighting than die running. I'd rather take some of them with me than just be their entertainment." Abel discovered similar determination in the others. There was Thomas, a field hand who had watched his wife sold away 3 years earlier. Her price of $900 was used to settle the colonel's gambling debts after a poor night of cards in New Orleans. Thomas had attempted to purchase her freedom, had pleaded with the colonel to sell him instead, had offered to work double shifts for the rest of his existence. The colonel had laughed directly at him and sold the woman to a brothel in Mobile. There was Benjamin, who carried scars on his arms from a punishment that had involved holding hot coals for talking back to an overseer. a torture that had permanently damaged his hands, decreasing his value but not his hatred. There was Elijah, whose son had been beaten to death at age 12 for taking an apple from the colonel's orchard. His small body was valued at nothing in the plantation records, his murder recorded simply as disposed of damaged property, with no further explanation or consequence. There was Marcus, who had been separated from his mother at age 8 and sold at auction in Charleston for $400, who could still recall her screaming his name as he was loaded onto a wagon. There was Joseph, purchased just a year ago for $1,000 after his previous owner became bankrupt, who had been a house servant at a relatively comfortable plantation before being sold to the brutal conditions of Blackwater. Each man had a narrative written in scars and loss. Each man had reached the point where death held no more terror than life. Each man was prepared. By late May, they had 10 men committed to the strategy. They had weapons hidden in 3 separate locations around the property. They had detailed knowledge of the swamp, the timing of patrols, the habits of the overseers. They had Ruth and 3 other house servants ready to assist from inside the main house, to drug food if needed, to unlock doors, to create diversions. They had Moses ready to manage the horses, to scatter them at the crucial moment. They had Samuel ready to break the locks on the ammunition storage if the opportunity arose. What they didn't have was any certainty that the plan would succeed. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. A single betrayal would condemn them all to torture and execution. A single mistake, one moment of hesitation or panic could undo everything. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was extremely narrow. Abel lay awake at night reviewing every detail, searching for vulnerabilities, playing out scenarios in his mind. The weight of responsibility pressed on him like something physical, like carrying another person on his back. These men were entrusting him with their lives. Their families, the other slaves on the plantation, everyone was at risk. If he failed, if the plan collapsed, the consequences would be measured in blood and screams. The colonel would create examples that would be discussed for decades. Public torture and execution designed to crush any thought of resistance anywhere in the South. But if he succeeded, if they actually accomplished this, they would deliver a blow that would echo far beyond Blackwater Plantation. They would demonstrate that enslaved people could fight back, could organize, could defeat their oppressors despite overwhelming odds. They would generate a story that would spread from plantation to plantation, whispered in fields and cabins, sung in coded spirituals, carrying a message of resistance and hope to thousands of people who lived without either. On June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his official selections for the race. He assembled all the male slaves in the main yard, moving among them like a man choosing livestock at market, examining muscles and teeth, asking questions about stamina and speed. He selected 10 men, calling out their names one by one with casual authority: Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 others who were not part of the conspiracy, who knew nothing about the plan. Simon, David, and Jacob. Abel's heart sank like a stone in water. 3 men who knew nothing. 3 men who would panic when the plan unfolded. 3 men who could ruin everything through ignorance or fear or simple bad luck. That evening he approached them separately, taking an enormous risk. Simon was 35, a quiet man who had been at Blackwater for 8 years, who kept to himself and rarely spoke. David was 42, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident in the lumber mill where a saw had caught his hand, an injury that had reduced his value by $300. Jacob was barely 19, newly purchased for $3,100 from a Mississippi plantation, still raw from being torn away from his mother just weeks earlier. Abel told them everything. He laid out the entire plan, the weapons, the timing, the coordinated attack, the risks. He explained that they had 2 choices: join the conspiracy and have a chance at freedom and revenge, or run blindly into the swamp and die like the 70 men before them. Their deaths entertainment for wealthy men who would forget their names before breakfast. Simon listened carefully, his face revealing nothing. Then he asked a single question in a voice steady as iron. "You really think we can kill them all?" "No," Abel answered honestly, "because lies would help no one now. I think some of us will die, maybe most of us, maybe all of us. But I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running like an animal while they place bets on how long I last." Simon thought for a moment, weighing possibilities. Then he extended his hand. "I'm in. Been waiting 8 years for a chance like this." David was harder to convince. He was older, more cautious, worn down by years of brutality that had taught him the futility of resistance. "Even if we kill everyone here," he said slowly, "they'll send the army. They'll send bounty hunters. They'll track us to Mexico if they have to. They'll make it a national cause, proof that slaves can't be trusted, justification for even worse treatment everywhere." "Maybe," Abel agreed. "Probably. But at least we'll die as men, not as property. At least we'll make them pay a price. At least somewhere some other slaves will hear about what we did and know it's possible." David stared at his mutilated hand, the 2 missing fingers a permanent reminder of how little white men cared about black bodies, how easily they discarded and damaged human beings in pursuit of profit. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'm in. Got nothing left to lose anyway." Jacob was the biggest risk. He was young, scared, still harboring illusions that compliance might earn mercy, that being a good slave might result in decent treatment. But he was also angry, still raw from being torn from his mother and sold like cattle. Abel gambled on that anger, on the freshness of his wounds. "They paid Fudden 100 for you," Abel told him quietly. "You know what that means. You're expensive property, valuable prime stock. But the moment you step into that swamp, you stop being valuable. You become entertainment. They're gonna shoot you for fun like you're a deer or a rabbit. Your mother sold you thinking at least you'd live, at least you'd survive, even if she never saw you again. You want to prove her wrong. You want to die for their amusement 3 weeks after she said goodbye." Tears rolled down Jacob's face, but his jaw was set. What do I have to do? Now they were 13, 10 who had planned for months, and 3 who had been forced to adapt instantly. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to be enough. The final 2 weeks passed in agonizing slowness, each day stretching out endlessly. The plantation buzzed with preparation for the race. Carriages began arriving daily, bringing wealthy men from across the South. They came with servants, with hunting dogs on leashes, with expensive rifles in leather cases. They filled the guest quarters in the main house and overflowed into tents erected on the lawn, creating a temporary village of wealth and privilege. The smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke hung over the property constantly. At night, lantern light spilled from the main house windows as the guests drank and gambled and told stories about previous hunts, about slaves they had killed, about the entertainment value of human suffering. Ruth reported the names she overheard while serving drinks. Richard Beaumont from New Orleans, a sugar plantation owner worth over 200,000, who owned 3 plantations and over 400 slaves. Henry Caldwell from Alabama, who owned 4 plantations and nearly 600 slaves, who had built his fortune on cotton and cruelty in equal measure. William Preston from Georgia, who had won $3,000 at last year's race by correctly betting that 1 slave would survive past midnight but not see dawn. Thomas Ashford from Mississippi, who had brought 12 dogs and was offering side bets of 100 per dog on which animal would draw first blood. Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, who owned a slave trading company and had personally auctioned over 15,000 human beings in his career, separating families and selling children with the casual efficiency of a man selling livestock. These were not poor men struggling to survive. These were not desperate men driven by need. These were the wealthiest, most powerful members of Southern society, men who shaped laws and controlled governments, men who sat in state legislatures and congressional seats, men who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization while organizing hunts of human beings for entertainment. They saw no contradiction in attending church on Sunday and betting on how long a man could survive being hunted on Saturday. The betting pool grew larger than any previous year. By June 14th, it had reached a 52,000 in gold coins, banknotes, and promissory notes from banks across the South. The colonel displayed it in leather bags on a special table in the main house, arranged like trophies for all the guests to admire. 52,000, more money than any slave would see in 10 lifetimes of labor. More money than most white men would earn in 20 years of work. All of it wagered on human suffering. The slaves working in the main house reported that the guests were particularly excited this year. They spoke of fresh blood and new sport. They discussed strategy for the hunt, debated the best positions, compared weapons. They fed the dogs raw meat and let them go hungry for 2 days before the race to sharpen their hunger and aggression, to make them more vicious when released. On the morning of June 15th, the selected 13 were separated from the other slaves and taken to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. As promised, they were kept unchained, though 4 armed overseers watched them constantly from a raised platform. They were given extra food, cornbread and actual meat, a mockery of kindness designed to give them energy for running. The white men wanted good sport. They didn't want their prey to collapse from exhaustion. Before the entertainment began, Abel used the time to review the plan one final time with the others, speaking in voices too low for the overseers to hear. They huddled in a corner of the pen, their bodies blocking the view, their words carried away by the afternoon breeze. Samuel would be positioned near the eastern edge, where he had hidden 3 iron blades wrapped in oilcloth. Moses would head for the western side, near where the horses were tied to a rail fence. Thomas and Benjamin would stay together in the center, where crude spears fashioned from sharpened wood were buried under leaves and mud. The others would spread out in a loose formation, each man knowing his role, each man ready to adapt if things went wrong, which they almost certainly would. The critical moment would come 30 minutes after they were released, when the hunters entered the swamp, with confidence high and guard down. The slaves would not be running away in panic. They would be circling back, using paths they had studied for months, positioning themselves for ambush, turning from prey into predators. They think we're animals, Abel told the others quietly. They think we're going to run in panic, make mistakes, die easy. That's what they've seen for 7 years. That's what they expect. So we give them the opposite. We move slow and careful. We move quiet. We use everything we know about this swamp that they know nothing about. And when they come into our territory, when they're spread out and overconfident, we take them apart one by one. As darkness fell across Blackwater Plantation, the guests assembled near the starting point. Dozens of lanterns illuminated the scene, casting long, dancing shadows across the lawn. The dogs strained at their leashes, snarling and snapping at the air. The hunters checked their weapons with practiced efficiency, loading rifles and pistols, adjusting sights, preparing for the hunt. The colonel stood on his raised platform, addressing the crowd with whiskey-soaked pride, his voice booming across the assembled wealth. "Gentlemen," he called out, spreading his arms wide. "Welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. This year we have 13 fine specimens for your entertainment. The betting pool stands at 52,000, the largest in our history. As always, bets may be placed on survival time, distance traveled, or manner of death. The prey will be released at 900 sharp. The hunt begins at 9:15. May the best hunter win, and may we all enjoy a profitable evening." The crowd cheered enthusiastically. Money changed hands as last-minute wagers were made. Someone bet 500 that no slave would make it past the first creek. Someone else bet 300 that the dogs would kill at least 3 men before the hunters fired a shot. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, like a county fair or holiday gathering. The 13 men were led to the starting line by overseers with whips and rifles. Abel looked back at the assembled white men, at their confident faces, at their expensive clothing, at the weapons glinting in the lantern light. He memorized every detail. These were the faces of people who considered themselves superior, who believed they had a god, given right to own and destroy human beings, who built their entire civilization on the principle that some lives had value and others did not. In a few hours, Abel thought, some of those faces would be gone forever. The colonel raised a pistol high above his head. The crowd fell silent, anticipation thick in the air. Then he fired into the sky, the shot echoing across the property. The race had begun. The 13 men sprinted into the darkness, their feet splashing through shallow water at the swamp's edge. Behind them, the crowd roared with excitement. Someone shouted encouragement to their favorite hunter. The dogs howled desperately, straining to be released. But for exactly 15 minutes, the slaves would have a head start. Time to establish distance. Time to disappear into the labyrinth of water and trees. Abel led the group deeper into the swamp, but not at full speed. Running all out would exhaust them within minutes and leave them gasping for breath when they needed to be silent. They needed to preserve energy and stay together. In previous years, the slaves had scattered in panic, each man trying to save himself, that individualism dooming them all to isolation and death. 200 yards, then we split. Abel called back to the others, his voice low but clear. Remember the markers. Remember the plan. They had spent weeks learning this terrain, mapping every feature in their minds. That lightning struck cypress meant turn left towards solid ground. That cluster of rocks meant safety for 50 feet. That patch of glowing moss meant quicksand that could swallow a man in minutes. Knowledge was their only real advantage against horses and guns and trained dogs. At exactly 9:15, they heard the second gunshot. The hunters were coming. They heard dogs baying, men shouting to each other, the splash of horses entering the water. Now, Abel hissed. The group split into 4 units as planned. Abel took Simon, Jacob, and Caleb with him, circling toward the eastern edge where Samuel had hidden weapons. Thomas and Benjamin moved west with David, heading for the wooden spears. Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah headed north toward the deepest part of the swamp, where horses couldn't follow, where the water was over a man's head and cypress roots created a maze no one could navigate without intimate knowledge. Each group knew their route, their destination, their timing. The plan was for everyone to circle back toward the starting point from different directions, creating confusion, making the hunters think they were chasing fleeing prey, when in reality they were walking into carefully prepared killing zones. Abel's group moved quickly through water that came up to their thighs, cold and black, and smelling of decay. They could hear the hunters behind them shouting coordinates to each other, the dogs baying with bloodlust. But the sounds were moving in the wrong direction. The hunters were following the obvious trail, the one that led deeper into the swamp in a straight line. They think we're running straight like everyone before us, Caleb whispered, following instinct instead of strategy. Good, Abel replied quietly. Let them think we're animals. They reached the lightning, struck cypress, and found Samuel's cache exactly where it was supposed to be. 3 pieces of iron filed into crude blades, each about 8 inches long, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. Abel took one. Feeling the weight in his hand, the rough metal grip Samuel had fashioned, he gave the others to Caleb and Jacob. Simon picked up a heavy branch thick as a man's arm that would serve as an effective club. Remember what we planned, Abel said quietly, all of them crouching in the shadows with water lapping at their chests. We don't attack unless we're sure we can win. We pick off stragglers and isolated hunters. We avoid groups. We use the darkness and their own confusion against them. They crouched low in the water, only their heads above the surface, and waited with the patience of men who had spent their entire lives waiting, who understood that patience was sometimes the only power the powerless possessed. The first hunter appeared 23 minutes later, moving alone through the darkness. He was young, maybe 25, wearing expensive riding clothes, now soaked and muddy. He carried a rifle that probably cost more than Abel's sale price.